There's a blue velvet box sitting on my nightstand that I haven't opened in 68 years. Inside, there's a class ring from Cedar Falls High School, 1953. I was supposed to wear it with pride at graduation, but I never made it to that ceremony. Every evening, when the sun sets behind the oak trees in my backyard, I remember that spring day when I came home from school and found my best friend Susan sitting at our kitchen table, wearing my mother's apron. She looked up at me with those green eyes I'd trusted since we were 7 years old, and said the words that shattered my world, "Dorothy, honey, your father and I got married this morning." I was 16. She was 17. And my father, well, he was old enough to know better. The cherry pie cooling on the windowsill suddenly smelled like betrayal. The house where my mother had died just 2 years before felt like a tomb. And the girl who knew all my secrets, who'd braided my hair and shared my dreams, she was now my stepmother. That blue velvet box has been waiting all these years for me to find the courage to tell this story. Today, I finally will. Some wounds never heal, they just teach you how to live with the pain. This is the story of how I lost my best friend and my father in the same moment, and how it changed everything I thought I knew about trust and love. My name is Dorothy May Porter, and in 1953, I was just a 16-year-old girl living in Cedar Falls, Iowa, dreaming of graduation and whatever came next. Our town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where the main street had one traffic light and the biggest excitement was the Friday night football games. I lived with my father, Robert Porter, in a white wooden house with a wraparound porch that my mother had loved so much. She used to sit there every evening, shelling peas or mending clothes, watching the world go by. But she'd been gone for 2 years by then, taken by tuberculosis when I was just 14. Those were the hardest years of my life, watching her waste away in that bed, coughing up blood into her handkerchief while trying to smile for me. My father, he never quite recovered from losing her. He was a good man, owned Porter's hardware store on Main Street, worked with his hands, fixed things for people. But after Mama died, he became quiet, distant, like a part of him had been buried with her. That's when Susan Walsh became more than just my best friend, she became my lifeline. Susan was an orphan, raised by her aunt and uncle on the other side of town. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 5, and I think that shared pain of loss is what brought us together. We were both girls trying to figure out how to live without our mothers, except she'd been doing it longer. Susan had this way of making everything seem possible, like the world was bigger than Cedar Falls, bigger than our small lives. She had beautiful auburn hair that caught the light, green eyes that sparkled when she laughed, and this confidence that I envied. While I was shy and bookish, Susan could talk to anyone, charm her way into any situation. She spent so much time at our house that my father used to joke she was like the daughter he never had. After school, we'd walk to the soda fountain at Miller's Pharmacy, share a chocolate malt, and talk about our dreams. Susan wanted to see the world, maybe move to Chicago or New York. I just wanted to finish high school, maybe become a teacher like Miss Henderson, who made literature come alive in her classroom. But more than anything, I wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere again, like I had a family that was whole. My father seemed to enjoy having Susan around too. She'd help me with dinner, laugh at his jokes, ask about his day at the hardware store. Sometimes I'd catch him watching her with this soft expression, and I'd think how nice it was that he was happy again. Susan had this gift for making people feel comfortable, like they mattered. She'd listen to my father's stories about the war, about how he'd met my mother at a church dance, about his dreams of expanding the store. I was grateful that she cared about him, about us. We were like a little family, the 3 of us, trying to heal from our losses together. Susan would stay for dinner most nights, help me with the dishes, and we'd sit on the porch afterward, talking about everything and nothing. She knew all my secrets, my fears about not being pretty enough, smart enough, good enough. She knew I was scared of being alone, scared that I'd never find love like my parents had. And I knew her secrets too, how she worried about being a burden to her aunt and uncle, How she sometimes cried at night missing parents she could barely remember. We were each other's anchor in a world that had taken so much from us so young. As spring arrived in 1953, I was counting down the days to graduation. I had my dress picked out, my speech prepared as salutatorian, my plans to attend the State Teachers College in the fall. Susan was planning to move to Des Moines after graduation, work in a department store, start her grand adventure. Everything seemed perfect, like we were finally moving forward, finally healing. But sometimes, when you think you've found your footing, life has a way of pulling the ground out from under you. You know, when you lose your mother at 14, you don't just lose a person, you lose your blueprint for what it means to be a woman, what it means to be loved unconditionally. I spent those 2 years after Mama's death feeling like I was floating in space, untethered from everything that had once felt solid and safe. My father, bless his heart, he tried his best, but he was drowning in his own grief, working longer hours at the store just to avoid coming home to the silence that had replaced my mother's laughter. That's when Susan became more than a friend to me, she became my anchor. She had this way of filling the empty spaces in our house, in our lives, with her presence. When she'd help me braid my hair the way Mama used to, or when she'd hum while doing dishes, it was like she was bringing some kind of life back into our home. I didn't realize it then, but I was trying to replace my mother with my best friend, and in doing so, I was setting up a situation that would destroy us all. Susan had lost her parents so young that she barely remembered what it felt like to have a real family, and I think our little household gave her something she'd been craving her whole life. My father, he was a man who'd built his entire world around taking care of the women he loved, first my mother, then me. When Mama died, he didn't know how to channel that protective, nurturing energy. He was like a man whose job had been taken away, wandering around lost, unsure of his purpose. Susan's presence in our home gave him something to focus on again, someone to care for, someone to make smile. I see now that we were all just broken people trying to heal each other, but we were doing it in ways that were bound to cause more damage. I was a girl desperate for a mother figure, my father was a man desperate to feel needed again, and Susan was a young woman desperate to belong to a real family. We were all vulnerable, all aching, all trying to fill voids that maybe weren't meant to be filled so quickly, so carelessly. The tragedy wasn't that we loved each other, it was that we loved each other in ways that were confused, misguided, inappropriate. I loved Susan like a sister, like the mother I'd lost, but I also depended on her in ways that put too much pressure on a 17-year-old girl. My father loved Susan like a daughter, but he also saw in her the youth and vitality that had been drained from our house when Mama died. And Susan, she loved us both, but she was trying to be too many things to too many people, daughter, sister, caretaker, all while still being a child herself. There's something about grief that makes you grab onto whatever feels like comfort, whatever promises to take the pain away, even if it's wrong, even if it's going to hurt more people in the long run. We were all so tired of hurting, so desperate for something that felt like happiness again, that we ignored the warning signs, the boundaries, the simple fact that some relationships can't be forced into shapes they were never meant to take. I think about that spring of 1953, and I remember how grateful I felt to have Susan in our lives, how it seemed like maybe we were finally becoming whole again. But wholeness built on confusion and inappropriate attachments isn't real wholeness, it's just a house of cards waiting to collapse. And collapse it did, in the most devastating way possible. When you're 16 and your world falls apart, you think it's the end of everything. But the truth is, it's just the beginning of learning that the people you trust most are capable of the deepest betrayals, and that sometimes the family you think you're building is actually the family that's about to destroy you. It started with little things, the kind of changes that you notice but don't really notice, if you know what I mean. In early April of 1953, about 6 weeks before graduation, I began to see Susan differently, or maybe I began to see her more clearly. She'd always spent a lot of time at our house, but suddenly it seemed like she was there all the time, arriving before I got home from school, staying long after dinner was over. I'd walk up our front steps and hear her voice coming from the kitchen, talking to my father about things that seemed too grown up, too intimate for a 17-year-old girl to be discussing with her best friend's father. She'd be asking him about his day at the hardware store, about whether he'd eaten lunch, about whether he needed anything mended or cleaned. These weren't the conversations of a teenager visiting her friend's house, these were the conversations of someone who felt responsible for taking care of him. When I'd walk into the kitchen, their conversations would stop abruptly, and they'd both look at me with these bright, almost guilty smiles, like they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't have been doing. But caught doing what? Talking? It seemed innocent enough, but there was something in the air, something that made me feel like I was intruding in my own home. My father started smiling more, humming while he shaved in the morning, taking extra care with his appearance. He'd always been a neat man, clean-shaven, pressed shirts, but suddenly he seemed to be putting more effort into how he looked. He bought new aftershave, started wearing the good cologne that he'd only worn to church and special occasions. He'd stand in front of the mirror longer, adjusting his tie, smoothing his hair, like he was trying to impress someone. I thought maybe he was finally coming out of his grief, finally ready to rejoin the world, and I was happy for him. But there was something about the way he'd look at Susan when she was in the room, this soft, grateful expression that made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't quite name. Susan, too, seemed different. She'd always been confident, but now she carried herself with a new kind of authority around our house. She knew where everything was, how my father liked his coffee, what time he usually came home from work. She'd start dinner before I got home, set the table without being asked, pour my father's coffee without him having to request it. It was like she was becoming the lady of the house, and I was becoming the guest. When I'd offer to help with cooking or cleaning, she'd wave me away, saying she had everything under control, that I should focus on my studies. It felt like she was taking care of everything so I wouldn't have to, but it also felt like she was taking over everything so I couldn't. The most unsettling thing was how they'd look at each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd catch glimpses of glances across the dinner table, small smiles that seemed to carry meanings I didn't understand. When Susan would reach across the table to refill my father's water glass, their hands would touch for just a moment longer than necessary. When she'd laugh at his jokes, she'd lean forward slightly, like she was hanging on his every word. These interactions had an intimacy to them that made me feel like I was watching something private, something that wasn't meant for my eyes. I started paying closer attention, trying to figure out what was happening in my own home. I'd linger in doorways, listen to their conversations when they thought I was upstairs doing homework. I heard my father telling Susan about his dreams of expanding the hardware store, about maybe opening a second location. These were dreams he'd never shared with me, dreams that seemed too big, too hopeful for a man who'd spent the last 2 years barely getting by. And Susan, she'd encourage him, tell him he was capable of anything, that he deserved success and happiness. She spoke to him like a woman speaks to a man she believes in, not like a teenager speaks to her friend's father. Something was shifting in our little family, something that made me feel like I was being left behind, like decisions were being made without me, like my place in my own home was becoming smaller and smaller. But I couldn't name what it was, couldn't point to any one thing and say, this is wrong, this is the problem. All I knew was that something was changing, and I was afraid. I spent the next few weeks trying to convince myself that I was imagining things, that my grief over losing Mama had made me paranoid and suspicious of the people who loved me most. After all, what was I really seeing? A lonely widower enjoying the company of a sweet young woman who reminded him of happier times? A girl who'd lost her parents finding comfort in a father figure who treated her with kindness? These were good things, healthy things, signs that we were all healing from our losses. I told myself that Susan was just being helpful, that she was grateful for the family we'd provided her, and this was her way of showing appreciation. My father was finally smiling again, finally engaging with life instead of just surviving it. Wasn't this what I'd been praying for? Wasn't this what Mama would have wanted, for him to find reasons to be happy again? But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, there was this gnawing feeling in my stomach that wouldn't go away. I'd lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the looks I'd caught between them, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way Susan seemed to know things about my father's routines and preferences that I didn't even know. I'd tell myself I was being silly, that I was jealous of the attention Susan was getting, that I was somehow threatened by the idea that my father might care about someone other than me. Maybe I was being selfish, wanting to keep him all to myself, not wanting to share his affection with anyone else. After all, I'd been his only focus for 2 years, the center of his world after Mama died. Maybe I just wasn't ready to let go of that special position, wasn't ready to accept that he might need more than just me to be happy. I'd watch Susan at school, looking for signs of guilt or secrecy, but she seemed exactly the same as always. She'd link arms with me as we walked down the hallways, share her lunch, help me with my algebra homework. She'd talk about her plans for after graduation, her dreams of seeing the world, her excitement about leaving Cedar Falls behind. She never mentioned spending extra time with my father, never hinted that anything unusual was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was I so desperate to find something wrong that I was creating problems where none existed? But then I'd come home and see them together, and that feeling would come rushing back. The way they'd both look startled when I walked into the room, like they'd been caught in the middle of something important. The way Susan would quickly busy herself with some task, and my father would clear his throat and ask about my day in a voice that sounded too loud, too cheerful. The way they seemed to have developed their own rhythm, their own understanding, their own private world that I was somehow outside of. I started questioning everything. When Susan would compliment my father's cooking, was she just being polite, or was there something more? When she'd ask him about his day at the hardware store, was she just making conversation, or was she genuinely interested in the details of his life? When she'd stay after dinner to help with dishes, was she just being helpful, or was she looking for excuses to spend more time with him? I felt like I was going crazy, reading meaning into every glance, every word, every gesture. Part of me wanted to confront them, to ask directly what was going on, but what would I say? I had no evidence, no proof, just this terrible feeling that something was wrong. What if I was wrong? What if I accused them of something that existed only in my imagination? I'd ruin everything, destroy the peace we'd finally found, drive away the only person who'd brought happiness back into our home. But what if I was right? What if something inappropriate was happening right under my nose, and I was too naive, too trusting to see it clearly? The thought made me sick to my stomach. Susan was my best friend, the sister I'd never had, the person I trusted more than anyone in the world. My father was my protector, my hero, the man who'd raised me to believe in goodness and decency. They couldn't be betraying me, betraying everything we meant to each other. Could they? I began to pray every night, asking God to either show me the truth or take away these horrible suspicions that were eating me alive. I'd kneel beside my bed, the same bed where Mama used to tuck me in, and beg for clarity, for peace, for the strength to handle whatever was coming. Because deep down, underneath all my rationalizations and self-doubt, I knew something was coming. I could feel it in the air, like the stillness before a storm, that electric tension that tells you everything is about to change. And I was terrified that when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The moment that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, 3 weeks before our graduation ceremony. I'd stayed after school to help Miss Henderson organize the library books, and when I walked up our front steps around 4:30, I expected to find the house empty. My father didn't usually come home from the hardware store until 6, and Susan had mentioned having to help her aunt with spring cleaning. But as I approached the front door, I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, low and intimate, the kind of conversation you have when you think no one is listening. I paused on the porch, my hand on the door handle, trying to make out what they were saying. I could hear Susan's voice, soft and concerned, asking my father if he'd been eating enough, if he'd been sleeping well. She was speaking to him the way a wife speaks to a husband, not the way a 17-year-old girl speaks to her best friend's father. And my father, his voice was different too, gentle and grateful, like he was talking to someone precious, someone he was afraid of losing. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding, before I finally opened the door and called out that I was home. The voices stopped immediately, and I heard the quick scrape of chairs against the kitchen floor, the rustle of movement, the sound of people trying to arrange themselves into appropriate positions. When I walked into the kitchen, Susan was standing at the sink, washing dishes that hadn't been dirty when I left for school that morning. She was wearing my mother's apron, the one with the yellow flowers that Mama had worn every day while cooking dinner. It was tied around Susan's waist, and she looked so natural in it, so comfortable, like she belonged there more than I did. My father was sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, watching Susan with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't the look of a man watching his daughter's friend help with chores. It was the look of a man watching a woman he cared about, a woman he was proud of, a woman who made him feel things he probably shouldn't be feeling. Susan turned when she heard me come in, and her cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright, like she'd been caught doing something she knew was wrong but couldn't quite bring herself to feel guilty about. She smiled at me, that same warm smile she'd given me every day for the past 9 years, but there was something different about it now, something that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hello, Dorothy," she said, "your father and I were just talking about the graduation ceremony. He's so proud of you, you know." She untied the apron and hung it on the hook by the stove, the same hook where my mother had hung it every night after dinner. The gesture was so casual, so practiced, like she'd done it 100 times before. How many times had she been here when I wasn't? How many afternoons had they spent together, talking and laughing and sharing moments that I knew nothing about? My father stood up and came over to hug me, his usual greeting after a long day, but even that felt different. He smelled like he'd been working in the store all day, the familiar scent of sawdust and metal and the lavender soap Mama had always kept in the bathroom. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite identify, a warmth, a contentment, like he'd been having a good day, a really good day. He asked me about school, about my classes, about whether I was ready for the final exams, but his questions felt automatic, like he was going through the motions of being interested in my life while his mind was somewhere else entirely. Susan stayed for dinner that night, as she had most nights for the past month, but this time I watched her differently. I watched the way she moved around our kitchen like she owned it, opening cabinets without asking where things were, seasoning the food without tasting it first because she already knew how my father liked it prepared. I watched the way she set the table, putting my father's napkin on the left side of his plate the way Mama used to do, the way I'd never even noticed until now. I watched the way she served him his food, making sure he had enough of everything, cutting his meat into smaller pieces because she somehow knew he had trouble with his back teeth. These were intimate gestures, the kind of care that comes from paying attention to someone's needs, from wanting to make them comfortable and happy. During dinner, they talked about things that had nothing to do with me. Susan asked about Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming into the hardware store looking for supplies to fix her fence. My father told her about the new shipment of garden tools that had come in, about how business was picking up now that spring was here. They discussed the weather, the town gossip, the price of lumber, like they were partners in running a household, making decisions together about things that mattered. I sat there eating my pot roast, feeling like a stranger in my own home, like I was watching my life from the outside. After dinner, I volunteered to do the dishes, hoping to get some time alone to think, but Susan insisted on helping. We stood side by side at the sink, just like we had hundreds of times before, but everything felt different now. She was humming while she dried the plates, the same song Mama used to hum while she cooked, and when she reached across me to put a glass in the cabinet, I smelled her hair, the same lavender scent that had always reminded me of Mama. Was she using Mama's shampoo? Had my father given her Mama's toiletries? The thought made me feel sick to my stomach. As we finished cleaning up, Susan mentioned that she'd been thinking about staying in Cedar Falls after graduation, maybe finding a job at the bank or the telephone company instead of moving to Des Moines like she'd planned. This was the first I'd heard of this change in her plans, and it surprised me. Susan had talked about leaving Cedar Falls for as long as I'd known her, about seeing the world, about making something of herself in a big city. Why would she suddenly want to stay in a small town where nothing ever happened? Unless something was happening, something that made staying worth her while. That night, after Susan had gone home to her aunt and uncle's house, I sat on my bed and tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The apron, the casual intimacy, the way they'd looked at each other, the change in Susan's plans. None of it made sense unless I accepted the possibility that something was happening between them, something that went beyond friendship, beyond the normal relationship between a man and his daughter's friend. But accepting that possibility meant accepting that the two people I loved most in the world were capable of betraying me in the most devastating way possible. And I wasn't ready to believe that. Not yet. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective in my own home, watching and listening for clues that would either confirm my worst fears or prove that I was losing my mind. What I discovered was worse than I could have imagined, not because of any single dramatic revelation, but because of the thousand small intimacies that revealed a relationship I'd been blind to for months. Susan knew things about my father that I didn't know, things that only someone who spent significant time with him, alone, could possibly know. She knew that he liked his coffee with exactly 2 teaspoons of sugar, no cream, and that he always drank it from the blue mug that had been my mother's favorite. She knew that he had trouble sleeping since Mama died, that he'd get up in the middle of the night and sit on the porch, smoking cigarettes and staring at the empty street. She knew that he'd been thinking about selling the hardware store, that he was tired of dealing with difficult customers and mounting bills and the loneliness of running a business that had once been his and Mama's dream together. How did she know these things? When had he told her? And why had he never shared any of this with me, his own daughter? I started paying attention to the small details, the everyday moments that revealed the depth of their connection. When Susan would arrive in the afternoons, she'd go straight to the kitchen and start preparing coffee without asking if my father wanted any. She'd use the blue mug automatically, add exactly the right amount of sugar, and have it ready by the time he walked in from the store. She'd greet him with a smile that was different from the smiles she gave me, warmer, more personal, like she was genuinely happy to see him in a way that went beyond politeness. And my father, he'd light up when he saw her, his whole face changing, his shoulders relaxing, like he'd been carrying a burden all day and could finally set it down. She'd ask about his day, and he'd actually tell her, not just the surface details he'd share with me, but the real stuff, the frustrations and small victories and worries that he'd been keeping to himself. I'd listen from the next room as he told her about Mrs. Patterson complaining about the price of nails, about how young Tommy Miller had helped him unload a delivery truck, about his concerns that the new Sears catalog was going to put him out of business. These were the kinds of conversations married people had, the daily debriefings that helped them process their lives together. Susan would respond with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions, offering advice, sympathizing with his struggles in ways that made him feel heard and understood. She'd remembered the names of his regular customers, knew which ones were difficult and which ones were kind, could anticipate his needs and concerns in ways that spoke to a deep familiarity with his inner life. Even more unsettling was the way she'd begun to take care of our home as if it were her own. She knew where everything was, from the good china in the dining room cabinet to the spare light bulbs in the basement storage closet. She could navigate our house in the dark, knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck, which windows were hard to open. She'd started doing small household tasks without being asked, mending my father's shirts, organizing his paperwork, keeping track of what we needed from the grocery store. These weren't the actions of a visitor or even a frequent guest, these were the actions of someone who felt responsible for the household, someone who saw herself as its caretaker. I'd come home from school to find her in my mother's garden, weeding the flower beds and watering the vegetables, her hands dirty and her sleeves rolled up, looking perfectly at home among the tomatoes and roses Mama had planted. She'd wear my mother's gardening gloves, use my mother's tools, hum the same songs my mother had hummed while working in the soil. It was like she was stepping into Mama's role, not just helping with the garden, but inhabiting it, making it her own. When I'd offer to help, she'd smile and tell me she had everything under control, that I should focus on my studies, that she enjoyed the work. But it felt like she was claiming territory, marking her place in our family in ways that made me feel like an outsider. The physical space of our home began to reflect her influence. Small things started appearing that hadn't been there before: a new tablecloth on the kitchen table, fresh flowers in the vase on the mantel, different soap in the bathroom that smelled like the perfume Susan wore. She'd rearranged the living room furniture to create a more comfortable seating area, hung new curtains in the kitchen that let in more light, organized the spice cabinet in a way that made more sense. These changes were subtle, tasteful, improvements that made our house feel more like a home. But they were also assertions of ownership, signs that Susan saw herself as having a permanent place in our lives, a voice in how we lived. My father not only allowed these changes, he seemed to encourage them, complimenting Susan on her good taste, thanking her for making our home more beautiful, more comfortable. He'd beam with pride when she'd serve a meal she'd cooked, as if her domestic skills reflected well on him somehow. He'd brag to customers at the hardware store about how Susan had helped him organize his inventory, how she'd suggested a better way to display the tools, how she'd convinced him to stay open an hour later on Saturdays. He talked about her the way a man talks about his wife, with pride and affection and a sense of partnership. The way he'd once talked about my mother. But perhaps the most disturbing thing was how natural they seemed together, how easily they'd fallen into the rhythms of a domestic partnership. They'd developed their own language of glances and gestures, their own inside jokes, their own way of communicating without words. Susan would raise an eyebrow when my father reached for a second helping of dessert, and he'd laugh and put his fork down, accepting her gentle disapproval with good humor. He'd give her a look when she'd start to clear the table before he'd finished eating, and she'd sit back down, waiting for him to be ready. These small negotiations, these tiny moments of give and take, spoke to an intimacy that had been building for months while I was completely oblivious. They'd begun to finish each other's sentences, to anticipate each other's needs, to move around the kitchen together without bumping into each other or getting in each other's way. When Susan would reach for a plate in the cabinet, my father would automatically step aside. When he'd go to the refrigerator, she'd move without thinking about it. They'd developed the kind of physical awareness of each other that comes from spending hours together in close quarters, from learning each other's patterns and preferences and personal space. It was like watching a dance that had been choreographed over months of practice, and I was the audience member who hadn't been invited to participate. The conversations they'd have when they thought I wasn't listening were the most revealing of all. I'd hear them talking about the future, about plans and dreams and possibilities that seemed to include both of them. Susan would suggest improvements to the hardware store, ways to modernize the business, ideas for attracting younger customers. My father would talk about wanting to travel, about places he'd always wanted to see, about how nice it would be to have someone to share adventures with. They'd discuss books they'd both read, movies they'd seen, opinions on everything from politics to religion to the best way to grow tomatoes. These weren't the conversations of a man and his daughter's friend, these were the conversations of two people who were building a life together, who saw themselves as a unit, as partners in ways that went far beyond friendship. I felt like I was watching my father fall in love, and the woman he was falling in love with was supposed to be my sister, my best friend, the person I trusted more than anyone in the world. The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I couldn't even process it fully. Instead, I just watched, horrified and fascinated, as the two people I loved most slowly revealed that they'd been living a secret life that didn't include me, that they'd been building a relationship that made me irrelevant to my own family. And still, I said nothing. I hoped I was wrong, prayed I was wrong, convinced myself that I was seeing things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew the truth. I just wasn't ready to face it yet. The worst part was how they'd started looking at each other when they thought I wasn't watching. There was a tenderness in their eyes, a soft affection that made me feel like I was intruding on something private every time I walked into the room. My father would touch Susan's hand when he passed her the salt at dinner, just a brief contact that lasted a second longer than necessary. She'd adjust his collar when he'd come in from the store, her fingers lingering on his neck in a way that seemed too intimate, too personal. These touches were small, innocent-looking, but they carried an electricity that made the air in the room feel charged, dangerous. I started noticing how they'd position themselves near each other, how they'd gravitate toward the same spaces, how they'd find excuses to be close. When Susan would wash dishes, my father would dry them, standing close enough that their arms would brush. When she'd work in the garden, he'd find reasons to be outside, offering to help, bringing her water, staying nearby even when there was nothing for him to do. They were drawn to each other like magnets, always seeking proximity, always finding ways to share the same space. It was the behavior of people who were falling in love, who couldn't bear to be apart, who were hungry for each other's presence in ways that went far beyond friendship or even family affection. And I was the only one who could see it, the only one who understood what was happening right in front of everyone's eyes. The guilt was eating me alive, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront them. What would I say? What proof did I have? How could I accuse my father and my best friend of betraying me based on glances and touches and the way they seemed to light up in each other's presence? I felt like I was going crazy, like I was the only one who could see the truth, like I was trapped in a nightmare where everyone else was sleepwalking through disaster. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in early May, exactly 1 week before graduation. I'd been at the library working on my valedictorian speech, trying to find the right words to talk about new beginnings and bright futures when all I could think about was the crumbling foundation of my own life. When I got home around 8:30, the house was dark except for a soft glow coming from the kitchen window. I assumed my father had gone to bed early and forgotten to turn off the lights, so I used my key to let myself in quietly, not wanting to wake him. But as I stepped into the hallway, I could hear voices coming from the kitchen, low and intimate, the kind of conversation that stops the moment someone else enters the room. I froze in the doorway, my heart hammering in my chest, and listened to words that would change everything forever. My father was saying something about how beautiful Susan looked in the lamplight, how young and full of life she seemed, how grateful he was that she'd come into their lives when they needed her most. And Susan, her voice soft and sweet, was telling him that she'd never felt as safe and loved as she did in this house, with him, that she'd never imagined she could feel this way about anyone. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping against the floor, footsteps moving closer together, and my father's voice, trembling with emotion, saying the words that shattered my world, "Susan, I know this is crazy, I know you're young and I'm old enough to be your father, but I think I'm falling in love with you." The silence that followed seemed to last forever, and I stood there in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall to keep myself upright, waiting for Susan to laugh, to tell him he was being silly, to remind him that she was just a girl, his daughter's best friend, that what he was suggesting was impossible. But instead, I heard her whisper, "Oh Robert, I've been hoping you'd say that. I've been feeling the same way for months, but I was so afraid you'd think I was terrible, that you'd send me away." And then, the sound that made me feel like I was dying, the soft sound of a kiss, gentle and tender and full of love, the sound of two people who'd been holding back their feelings finally letting go. I backed out of the hallway as quietly as I could, my legs shaking, my vision blurring with tears, and stumbled out the front door into the cool night air. I sat on the porch steps, my head in my hands, trying to process what I'd just heard. It wasn't just attraction or loneliness or a moment of weakness. They were in love with each other, had been for months, and they were planning to act on those feelings. The two people I trusted most in the world had been lying to me, deceiving me, carrying on a secret romance right under my nose while I went about my life completely oblivious to what was happening. When I finally worked up the courage to go back inside, they were sitting at the kitchen table, holding hands, talking in whispers about something that made them both smile. They looked up when I walked in, and I saw the guilt flash across both their faces, the quick way they dropped each other's hands, the two bright smiles they gave me. "Dorothy," Susan said, "we didn't hear you come in. How was the library?" But her voice was different, strained, like she was trying too hard to sound normal. My father cleared his throat and asked if I wanted some tea, if I'd eaten dinner, if I needed help with my speech. But he couldn't look me in the eye, couldn't meet my gaze without his face turning red. They both knew that something had changed, that the secret they'd been so careful to keep was somehow no longer safe. I mumbled something about being tired, about needing to get to bed early, and escape to my room as quickly as possible. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I could hear them talking downstairs, their voices urgent and worried. I couldn't make out the words, but I could hear the tone, the fear that their secret was about to be exposed, the panic of people who'd been caught doing something they knew was wrong. The next morning, they were both different, nervous, watching me carefully for signs that I knew something I shouldn't know. Susan's laugh was too loud, too forced. My father's questions about my day were too numerous, too detailed, like he was trying to keep me talking so I wouldn't have time to think about what I might have seen or heard. They were walking on eggshells around me, and I was walking on eggshells around them, and our house felt like it was full of landmines, just waiting for someone to step in the wrong place and blow everything apart. The secret was out, at least partially, and all three of us knew that things were about to change forever. The question was no longer whether I would find out about their relationship, but when, and how, and what would happen to all of us when the truth finally came to light. The weekend after I overheard their confession of love was the longest weekend of my life. Saturday morning, I woke up hoping that somehow I'd dreamed the whole thing, that I'd imagined the conversation between my father and Susan, that when I went downstairs for breakfast, everything would be normal again. But the moment I walked into the kitchen and saw them sitting at the table, carefully maintaining distance between them, speaking in the overly polite tones of people trying to hide something, I knew that nothing would ever be normal again. Susan was wearing a new dress, pale blue with tiny white flowers, and her hair was styled differently, swept up in a way that made her look older, more sophisticated. She looked beautiful, radiant even, like a woman who'd just discovered she was loved. My father was clean-shaven and wearing his good shirt, the one he usually saved for church and special occasions. They both looked like they were trying to impress someone, and I realized with a sick feeling that they were trying to impress each other. The secret of their mutual attraction was out between them now, and even though they were being careful around me, I could see the electricity crackling between them, the way they'd steal glances when they thought I wasn't looking, the way they'd find excuses to brush against each other while moving around the kitchen. When Susan reached across the table to refill my father's coffee cup, their fingers touched for just a moment, and I saw them both tense, saw the quick flush that rose in both their cheeks. They were like teenagers with a crush, giddy and nervous and completely absorbed in each other. And I felt like I was watching my family dissolve before my eyes. The worst part was how they tried to include me in their happiness, how they'd make an effort to bring me into their conversations, to ask about my graduation speech, my college plans, my friends at school. But their attention felt forced, distracted, like they were going through the motions of caring about my life while their minds were completely occupied with each other. Susan would start to ask me about something, then lose track of what she was saying when my father would smile at her. My father would be telling me about a customer at the hardware store, then trail off mid-sentence when Susan would laugh at something he'd said. They were so wrapped up in their newfound love that they didn't even realize they were making me feel invisible in my own home. I spent most of that weekend in my room, claiming I needed to study for final exams, but really I was just trying to avoid watching them fall deeper in love with each other. Every time I'd come downstairs for a meal or a glass of water, I'd find them in some intimate moment, heads bent together over a book, or Susan adjusting my father's collar, or my father showing Susan how to fix a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet. These weren't the interactions of a man and his daughter's friend, these were the interactions of a couple, comfortable with each other, domestic, planning a future together. By Sunday evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I was walking past the living room on my way to the kitchen when I saw them sitting on the couch together, Susan's head on my father's shoulder, his arm around her waist, both of them looking perfectly content, perfectly right together. They looked like they belonged together, like they were meant to be together, and that realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just a momentary attraction or a mistake that would blow over. This was real love, deep and genuine and lasting, and I was the only obstacle standing in the way of their happiness. The guilt was crushing me. Here were two people who'd found love in the midst of loss, who'd found comfort in each other's arms, who were healing each other's wounds and creating something beautiful together. And I was the one person who could destroy it all with a word, who could expose their secret and ruin their chance at happiness. What kind of person did that make me? What kind of daughter was so selfish that she'd rather see her father alone and miserable than happy with someone she disapproved of? But it wasn't just disapproval, it was betrayal. Susan was supposed to be my best friend, my sister, the person I trusted more than anyone in the world. She was supposed to be loyal to me, to put our friendship above everything else. Instead, she'd chosen my father over me, had fallen in love with him behind my back, had been lying to me for months about the most important thing in her life. How could I ever trust her again? How could I ever look at her without remembering that she'd chosen to deceive me, to sneak around with my father while pretending to be my friend? And my father, the man who'd raised me to believe in honesty and integrity, who'd taught me that family came first, that loyalty was everything. He betrayed those very principles by falling in love with my best friend, by pursuing a relationship that he knew would hurt me, by choosing his own happiness over my feelings. How could I ever respect him again? How could I ever feel safe with him again, knowing that he was capable of such deception? The approaching graduation ceremony made everything worse. This was supposed to be the most important day of my life, the culmination of 12 years of education, the moment when I'd give my valedictorian speech and receive my diploma and step into my future as an adult. But instead of excitement and pride, all I felt was dread. How could I stand up in front of the whole town and talk about new beginnings and bright futures when my own life was falling apart? How could I smile and accept congratulations when the two people who should have been proudest of me were too busy falling in love with each other to even notice what I was accomplishing? Susan was supposed to be my date to the graduation dance, the person I'd share this milestone with, the friend who'd celebrate with me and take pictures and make memories that would last a lifetime. But how could I dance with someone who was sleeping with my father? How could I pretend to be happy and carefree when my heart was breaking? The physical symptoms of stress were starting to show. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on my studies. I'd lost weight, had dark circles under my eyes, felt nauseous most of the time. My teachers started asking if I was feeling all right, if I needed to see the school nurse, if there was something wrong at home. But what could I tell them? That my father and my best friend were having an affair? That my family was falling apart just days before graduation? That I was too cowardly to confront them, too hurt to forgive them, too confused to know what to do? I started avoiding them both, spending more time at the library, at friends' houses, anywhere but home. But even when I wasn't there, I could feel the weight of their secret pressing down on me, poisoning every interaction, every conversation, every moment of what should have been the happiest time of my life. When I'd come home late in the evening, I'd find evidence of their deepening relationship everywhere. Susan's sweater draped over the back of my father's chair. 2 coffee cups in the sink, washed and put away but still warm. The scent of her perfume lingering in the living room. Small gifts that my father had clearly bought for her, a book of poetry on the kitchen counter, a bouquet of flowers from Miller's Pharmacy, a small silver bracelet that I'd never seen before but that Susan wore constantly now. They were building a life together, making plans, sharing dreams, and I was the outsider looking in, the inconvenient reminder of why their love was complicated, why their happiness came at such a high cost. The worst part was that I could see how much they loved each other, how right they were together, how much happier they both were than they'd been in years. My father was laughing again, singing while he worked, taking pride in his appearance. Susan was glowing, confident, full of life in a way she'd never been before. They were healing each other, completing each other, giving each other the love and companionship they'd both been missing. And I was the villain in their love story, the obstacle that kept them from being completely happy, the secret they had to keep, the problem they had to solve. I was 17 years old, and I felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, like every decision I made would determine the fate of everyone I loved. And I had no idea what to do. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came on Tuesday, May 19, 1953, 3 days before graduation. I'd been at school all day, sitting through classes I couldn't focus on, mechanically going through the motions of being a normal teenager while my world crumbled around me. When the final bell rang, I walked home slowly, dreading what I might find, what new evidence of their secret relationship would be waiting for me. But when I climbed the front steps and opened the door, I was greeted by something I never could have imagined. Susan was in the kitchen, wearing my mother's best dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that Mama had worn to church every Sunday. She was standing at the stove, stirring something in a pot, and when she turned to greet me, I saw that she was also wearing my mother's pearl earrings, the ones Daddy had given her for their 10th wedding anniversary. But it wasn't just the clothes that shocked me, it was the way Susan looked in them, confident and radiant, like she belonged in them, like she had every right to wear the clothes of a dead woman in front of that dead woman's daughter. "Hello, Dorothy," she said, and her voice was different, stronger, more authoritative than I'd ever heard it before. "I've been waiting for you to come home. We need to talk." My father appeared in the doorway behind her, and I could see immediately that something had changed. He looked nervous, guilty, but also determined, like a man who'd made a difficult decision and was prepared to face the consequences. Susan reached for his hand, and he took it without hesitation, and they stood there in my mother's kitchen, in front of my mother's stove, wearing my mother's clothes, holding hands like they had every right to be there, like they had every right to be together. "Dorothy," my father said, his voice shaking slightly, "Susan and I have something to tell you. Something important. Something that's going to change everything." I felt my knees go weak, felt the blood drain from my face, but I managed to stay standing, managed to look at them both, these two people who'd been lying to me for months, who'd been planning God knows what behind my back. Susan squeezed my father's hand, and I saw her give him a small, encouraging smile, the kind of smile a wife gives her husband when she's trying to give him courage. Then she looked at me, and her green eyes were bright with something that looked like joy, like she was about to share the most wonderful news in the world. "Dorothy, honey," she said, using the same gentle tone she'd used when we were children, and she was about to tell me something I didn't want to hear. "Your father and I got married this morning." The words hit me like a physical blow, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart until it stopped beating. I stared at them, unable to process what I'd just heard, unable to believe that the two people I loved most in the world had betrayed me so completely, so thoroughly, so devastatingly. "Married?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "You got married?" Susan nodded, her smile growing wider, more radiant. "We went to Judge Patterson's office this morning," she said. "It was a simple ceremony, just the two of us and his wife as a witness. We wanted to tell you first, before anyone else found out, because you're the most important person in both our lives." She was talking to me like she was sharing good news, like she expected me to be happy for them, like she thought I'd understand and forgive and welcome her into our family with open arms. But all I could think about was the betrayal, the months of lies, the way they'd made me feel crazy for suspecting what was right in front of my face. My father stepped forward, his hand extended toward me like he was trying to comfort a wounded animal. "Dorothy, sweetheart, I know this is a shock, I know you probably have questions, But I need you to understand that this isn't something that just happened. Susan and I have been talking about this for months, planning for it, making sure it was the right thing to do. We love each other, and we love you, and we want to be a family together. A family. They wanted to be a family, with Susan as my stepmother, with my best friend suddenly becoming my father's wife, with the girl I'd shared all my secrets with now sharing my father's bed. The thought made me sick to my stomach, made me feel like I was drowning in betrayal and confusion and rage. How could you do this to me? I finally managed to say, my voice getting stronger with each word. How could you get married without telling me? How could you lie to me for months? How could you pretend to be my friend when you were sneaking around with my father behind my back? Susan's smile faltered, and I saw a flash of the old Susan, the uncertain girl who'd always needed my approval, my acceptance. Dorothy, please, she said, reaching toward me with her free hand. I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted it to happen this way. But your father and we fell in love, and love isn't something you can control or plan or stop just because it's inconvenient. I laughed, a bitter, ugly sound that didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard from my own mouth. Inconvenient? I said. You think this is inconvenient? You married my father, Susan. You married him without telling me, without asking me, without caring how I'd feel about it. You're supposed to be my best friend, and you've been lying to me for months. Lying about everything. My father let go of Susan's hand and took a step toward me, his face full of the kind of pain I'd seen when my mother died, the kind of anguish that comes from knowing you've hurt someone you love. Dorothy, he said, his voice breaking, I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But I need you to understand that this wasn't about betraying you or lying to you. This was about finding love again, about finding someone who could help heal the wounds that your mother's death left in both of us. Susan isn't trying to replace your mother, she's trying to build something new with us, something that honors your mother's memory while still allowing us to move forward with our lives. But I was beyond reasoning, beyond understanding, beyond anything except the white-hot rage that was consuming me from the inside out. You want to honor Mama's memory? I screamed, my voice echoing off the kitchen walls. You want to honor her memory by marrying my 17-year-old best friend? By putting her things on another woman? By replacing her with someone who's barely older than your own daughter? Susan flinched like I'd slapped her, and I saw tears spring to her eyes, but I didn't care. I was done caring about Susan's feelings, done worrying about whether I was being fair or kind or understanding. They'd made their choice, and now they were going to have to live with the consequences. You're disgusting, I said, looking at my father with all the contempt I could muster. You're a grown man, and you married a child. A child who was supposed to be like a daughter to you. How can you look at yourself in the mirror? How can you sleep at night knowing what you've done? And you, I turned to Susan, my voice dripping with venom, you're a liar and a traitor and a homewrecker. You pretended to be my friend while you were seducing my father. You sat in my room and listened to me worry about finding love, about whether I'd ever be happy, while you were stealing happiness from right under my nose. I hope you're satisfied. I hope this is everything you dreamed it would be. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Susan's quiet sobs and my father's labored breathing. They stood there, holding each other, looking at me like I was a stranger, like I was the unreasonable one, like I was the problem that needed to be solved. And maybe I was. Maybe I was the selfish daughter who couldn't bear to see her father happy with someone new. Maybe I was the jealous friend who couldn't stand to see her best friend find love. Maybe I was the problem, the obstacle, the thing that stood between them and their happiness. But I didn't care. I was 17 years old, and my world had just exploded, and I was going to react exactly the way any 17-year-old would react when the two people she trusted most betrayed her in the most devastating way possible. I was going to run. I didn't pack much. How do you pack a lifetime in 20 minutes when your hands are shaking and your vision is blurred with tears and all you can think about is getting as far away as possible from the people who've just destroyed your world? I threw some clothes into my school bag, grabbed the few dollars I'd saved from my part-time job at Miller's Pharmacy, and took one last look around the room where I'd spent my childhood, where I'd dreamed about my future, where I'd planned a life that now seemed as distant as the moon. The blue velvet box with my class ring was sitting on the dresser, and I stared at it for a long moment, remembering how excited I'd been when I'd ordered it, how I'd planned to wear it with pride at graduation, how it was supposed to represent everything I'd accomplished. Now it just looked like a symbol of everything I was leaving behind, everything I'd lost, everything that would never be the same again. I left it there, closed and untouched, and walked out of that room for what I thought would be the last time. Downstairs, I could hear my father and Susan talking in urgent whispers, their voices full of panic and regret and the kind of desperation that comes from knowing you've made a terrible mistake and don't know how to fix it. Part of me wanted to go to them, to try to work things out, to find some way to make peace with what they'd done. But the larger part of me, the part that was screaming with hurt and betrayal and rage, just wanted to escape, to get away from them and their guilt and their attempts to make me understand something that I would never, ever understand. I called my Aunt Margaret from the phone in the hallway, the same phone I'd used to call Susan 1,000 times over the years, to share secrets and gossip and dreams about the future. Margaret was my mother's sister, living in Springfield, Illinois, about 3 hours away by bus. She'd always told me I was welcome to visit any time, that her door was always open, that she'd love to have me come stay with her for a while. When I called her that night, crying so hard I could barely speak, she didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She just said, "Pack your bag, honey, I'll be there in the morning to pick you up." The next morning, I was waiting on the front porch when her car pulled up, my bag at my feet, my high school diploma ceremony dress still hanging in the closet upstairs. My father came out to try to talk to me, to beg me to reconsider, to tell me that running away wouldn't solve anything. But I couldn't look at him without seeing Susan in my mother's dress, without hearing him say that he'd married my best friend, without feeling the crushing weight of his betrayal. Susan stayed inside, probably too ashamed to face me, too guilty to try to defend what they'd done. Margaret helped me put my bag in the car, and as we pulled away from the house where I'd grown up, I watched it disappear in the rearview mirror, along with everything I'd thought I knew about love and loyalty and family. The graduation ceremony was held that Friday, May 22, 1953, without me. I should have been there, walking across the stage in my white dress, giving my valedictorian speech about new beginnings and bright futures, accepting my diploma and the congratulations of my teachers and classmates. Instead, I was in Springfield, sitting in my aunt's kitchen, reading the letter that Miss Henderson had sent me, along with my diploma and the speech I'd never given. She wrote that everyone had been asking about me, that the whole town was buzzing with rumors about why Dorothy Porter had missed her own graduation, why the valedictorian had simply vanished 3 days before the ceremony. She said that my father had looked like a broken man, that Susan had been crying throughout the entire ceremony, that everyone could sense that something terrible had happened but nobody knew what. The speech I'd written seemed like it had been written by someone else, someone young and naive and optimistic, someone who still believed that families stayed together, that friends were loyal, that love was simple and pure and didn't destroy everything in its path. Reading it felt like reading a letter from a stranger, from a girl who'd never existed, who'd been replaced by someone harder, more cynical, more careful with her trust. I folded the speech carefully and put it in the drawer with my diploma, 2 pieces of paper that represented a life I'd never get to live, a future I'd never get to claim. At 17, I felt like my childhood had ended not with graduation, but with betrayal, not with celebration, but with exile. I was starting over in a new town, with a new name. Margaret had suggested I use her last name, Sullivan, to make the transition easier, a new identity that had nothing to do with the girl who'd trusted too much and lost everything. The cost of their love was my innocence, my family, my home, my graduation, my best friend, my father, and my faith in the idea that the people you love will always put your happiness before their own. I was learning that sometimes the price of other people's happiness is your own heartbreak, and that sometimes the only way to survive betrayal is to walk away from everything you've ever known and start again from nothing. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of carefully constructed normalcy, each day a small victory in the art of moving forward while carrying a broken heart. I lived with Aunt Margaret for 2 years, finishing my education at Springfield College, studying to become a teacher just like I'd always planned. But everything felt different now, muted, like I was watching my life happen from a distance, like I was playing a role in someone else's story. Margaret never asked too many questions about what had happened back in Cedar Falls, never pushed me to talk about my father or Susan or the reason I'd shown up on her doorstep with tears in my eyes and a single bag of belongings. She just accepted me into her quiet life, gave me a room and a place at her table, and let me heal at my own pace. But healing, I learned, was different from forgetting, and forgetting was impossible. I changed my name to Dorothy Sullivan, took my aunt's surname, and tried to become someone new, someone who hadn't been betrayed by the people she loved most. I threw myself into my studies, into my student teaching, into building a life that was safe and predictable and didn't require me to trust anyone too deeply. I made friends, but I kept them at arm's length, never letting anyone get close enough to hurt me the way Susan had. I dated a few young men, good men who seemed kind and sincere, but I couldn't let my guard down, couldn't stop looking for signs of deception, couldn't stop waiting for the moment when they'd reveal themselves to be something other than what they claimed to be. The letters started arriving about 6 months after I'd left Cedar Falls. First from my father, pages and pages of apologies and explanations, begging me to forgive him, to understand that he'd never meant to hurt me, that he loved me more than life itself and couldn't bear the thought of losing me forever. He wrote about how empty the house felt without me, how much he missed our conversations at dinner, how proud he was of my accomplishments even though he'd missed my graduation. He told me about the hardware store, about the customers who asked about me, about how he'd kept my room exactly as I'd left it, hoping I'd come home someday. But reading his letters felt like touching a wound that hadn't healed, so I stopped opening them, let them pile up in a shoebox in my closet, unopened and unread. Susan's letters were different, shorter, more desperate. She wrote about how sorry she was, how she'd never meant for things to happen the way they did, how she'd give anything to have me back in her life. She told me about married life, about how strange it felt to be called Mrs. Porter, about how she was trying to be a good wife to my father but couldn't stop thinking about the friendship we'd lost. She wrote about seeing my graduation dress hanging in my closet, about how she'd cried when she'd touched it, about how she'd begged my father to let her come to Springfield to try to make things right. But I couldn't bring myself to respond to her letters either, couldn't find words that would bridge the gap between what we'd been and what we'd become. How do you write to someone who used to be your best friend but is now your stepmother? How do you maintain a friendship with someone who's married to your father? The whole situation was so tangled, so inappropriate, so impossible that silence seemed like the only option. I graduated from college with honors, got my teaching certificate, and found a job at an elementary school in Springfield. My students loved me, and I loved them, these innocent children who didn't know anything about betrayal or broken trust, who still believed that adults were good and reliable and safe. Teaching gave me a purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, a way to make a difference in the world without having to risk my heart again. I lived in a small apartment near the school, kept a tidy home, attended church on Sundays, and slowly built a life that was peaceful and predictable and protected. But loneliness was my constant companion, a hollow ache that never quite went away. I'd see other women my age with their friends, laughing and sharing secrets and supporting each other through life's ups and downs, and I'd remember what it felt like to have someone who knew everything about me, who I could trust with my deepest fears and wildest dreams. I'd remember Susan, the girl who'd been like a sister to me, who'd understood me better than anyone else in the world, who'd thrown it all away for love. I'd watch fathers with their daughters, walking together, talking and laughing, and I'd remember my own father, the man who'd raised me and protected me and taught me about right and wrong, who'd chosen a 17-year-old girl over his own daughter. The wound of their betrayal had scabbed over, but it never fully healed, never stopped aching when the weather changed or when I was tired or when I saw something that reminded me of the family I'd lost. I learned to live with the pain, to carry it like a stone in my chest, heavy and constant and mine alone. Some nights I'd lie awake wondering if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too quick to cut them out of my life. But then I'd remember the feeling of finding out they'd been married, of realizing that they'd been planning a life together while lying to me for months, of understanding that I'd been the obstacle they'd had to overcome to be happy. And I'd know that I'd done the only thing I could do. I'd saved myself the only way I knew how. It was 1978, 25 years after I'd left Cedar Falls, when I finally understood what had really happened in my childhood home. I was 41 years old, teaching 4th grade in Springfield, living alone in the same small apartment I'd rented when I was 22. I'd built a good life, a quiet life, a safe life, but it was also a lonely life, and I was starting to feel the weight of all those years of self-imposed isolation. That's when I got the phone call that changed everything. It was Dr. Morrison from Cedar Falls General Hospital, calling to tell me that my father had suffered a heart attack and was asking for me. He was dying, the doctor said gently, and he'd been asking for his daughter Dorothy for 3 days straight. The nurses had finally tracked me down through the school district, and they wanted to know if I'd be willing to come see him, maybe for the last time. I hadn't spoken to my father in 25 years, hadn't responded to any of his letters, hadn't even sent a Christmas card. But hearing that he was dying, that he was asking for me, that he wanted to see me one more time, broke something open in my chest that I'd been keeping carefully sealed for decades. I drove the 3 hours to Cedar Falls in a state of numb shock, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The town had changed, grown, modernized, but the hospital was the same small building where I'd been born, where my mother had died, where my father was now waiting for me. Susan was there when I arrived, sitting in the chair beside his bed, holding his hand, her hair now silver instead of auburn, her face lined with the years I'd missed. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment we just stared at each other, two women who'd once been girls, who'd once shared everything, who'd been separated by a choice that had haunted us both for decades. She stood up without a word and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my father for the first time since 1953. He looked so small in that hospital bed, so frail and old, nothing like the strong man who'd raised me. But when he saw me, his eyes lit up with the same love I remembered from my childhood, the same unconditional acceptance that had made me feel safe and cherished for the first 16 years of my life. "Dorothy," he whispered, his voice weak but full of joy, "you came. I thought I'd die without ever seeing you again." I sat down in the chair Susan had vacated, the chair that was still warm from her body, and took his hand in mine. It was thin and papery, covered with age spots, but it was still my father's hand, still the hand that had comforted me when I was scared, that had taught me to ride a bicycle, that had braided my hair when I was too young to do it myself. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing, about the years we'd missed, about the regrets we both carried, about the love that had never died despite the silence that had stretched between us. He told me about his life with Susan, about how she'd been a good wife to him, how she'd taken care of him when he was sick, how she'd grieved when they'd lost the baby they'd tried so hard to have. He told me about the hardware store, about how he'd finally sold it and retired, about how he'd spent his golden years gardening and reading and missing his daughter every single day. And then he told me something that changed everything. "Dorothy," he said, his voice barely audible, "I need you to understand something about Susan, about why she did what she did. She was just a girl, honey, a scared, lonely girl who'd lost her parents and was trying to find a family, trying to find a place where she belonged. She didn't set out to hurt you, didn't plan to fall in love with me. It just happened, the way love sometimes does, messy and complicated and painful for everyone involved. But she never stopped loving you, never stopped missing you, never stopped hoping that someday you'd forgive her. She's been carrying the guilt of losing you for 25 years, blaming herself for destroying the most important friendship in her life. He squeezed my hand with what little strength he had left. She was 17, Dorothy. Just 17. And I was a lonely widower who should have known better, who should have been stronger, who should have protected both of you from the mess I created. If you're going to hate someone, hate me. But don't hate her. She loved you like a sister, and losing you has been the greatest regret of her life. That night, after my father had fallen asleep, I found Susan in the hospital cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. She looked up when I approached, and I saw the same fear in her eyes that I'd seen that day in 1953, the fear of someone who'd done something unforgivable and was waiting for judgment. But I also saw something else, the weight of 25 years of guilt, the exhaustion of carrying a secret shame for so long, the grief of losing not just a friendship but a sister. We didn't talk much that night, just sat together in the quiet hospital cafeteria, two women who'd once been girls, who'd once shared everything, who were trying to figure out how to forgive each other after all these years. But for the first time in 25 years, I wasn't angry. I was just tired, and sad, and ready to let go of the burden I'd been carrying for so long. My father died the next morning, peacefully, with both Susan and me holding his hands. And as I watched her grief, as I saw how much she'd loved him, how much she'd sacrificed for him, how much she'd missed me, I finally understood that we'd all been victims of circumstances beyond our control, children playing adult games, broken people trying to heal each other in the only way they knew how. The blue velvet box was waiting for me when I returned to my childhood home after my father's funeral, sitting exactly where I'd left it 25 years earlier, covered in dust but otherwise untouched. Susan had kept my room exactly as it had been, she told me quietly, just like my father had promised. Everything was preserved like a shrine to the girl I'd been, the girl who'd run away rather than face the complicated truth about love and loss and the messy way people try to heal each other. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, the same bed where I'd dreamed about my future, where I'd cried over my mother's death, where I'd planned a life that had never come to pass. The box felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with decades of anger and regret and stubborn pride. But also with something else, something I hadn't expected to find, forgiveness. I opened it slowly, and there it was, the class ring from Cedar Falls High School, 1953, still shining as if it had been waiting all these years for me to claim it. I slipped it onto my finger, and for the first time in 25 years, I felt like Dorothy Porter again, not Dorothy Sullivan, not the woman who'd run away, but the girl who'd had the courage to leave everything behind to protect her heart. Susan appeared in the doorway, hesitant, uncertain, carrying 2 cups of coffee prepared exactly the way I'd liked it when we were teenagers. She'd remembered, after all these years, she'd remembered how I took my coffee, just like I remembered how she used to hum while she did dishes, how she'd braid my hair when I was nervous, how she'd made me feel like I had a sister when I was an only child. We sat together on my old bed, 2 women in their 40s, drinking coffee and talking about the girls we'd been, the choices we'd made, the price we'd all paid for a love that had been real and deep and impossible. Susan told me about the nights she'd lain awake thinking about me, wondering if I was happy, if I'd found love, if I'd ever forgive her for choosing my father over our friendship. I told her about the years of loneliness, about the walls I'd built around my heart, about the students I'd taught who'd reminded me of us at that age, innocent and trusting and unprepared for the ways that love can destroy as easily as it can heal. We cried together, finally, for the friendship we'd lost, for the years we'd missed, for the girl who'd run away and the girl who'd stayed behind to pick up the pieces. But we also laughed, remembering the good times, the secrets we'd shared, the dreams we'd had before everything got so complicated. As the sun set behind the oak trees in my father's backyard, I realized that some wounds do heal, even if they leave scars. Some betrayals can be forgiven, even if they can't be forgotten. And sometimes, the people who hurt us the most are the ones who loved us the best, who were just too young or too scared or too broken to love us the right way. I kept the ring on my finger as I drove back to Springfield, back to my quiet life, back to my classroom full of children who still believed in happy endings. But for the first time in 25 years, I wasn't carrying the weight of anger anymore. I was carrying something lighter, something that felt like peace. The girl who'd run away had finally come home, not to stay, but to forgive, to heal, to remember that love, even when it's messy and complicated and painful, is still the most powerful force in the world. That was 68 years ago, and I'm 81 years old now, sitting in my living room with that same blue velvet box on the table beside me. The class ring still fits, still shines, still reminds me of the girl who thought she knew everything about love and loyalty and family. But I know better now. I know that love isn't always pure and simple and easy to understand. Sometimes it's messy and complicated and painful, and sometimes the people we love the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, not because they want to, but because they're human, and humans are imperfect, and imperfect people make imperfect choices. Susan and I never became close again, not the way we'd been as girls. Too much had happened, too many years had passed, too many wounds had been opened and closed and scarred over. But we did find a kind of peace with each other, a mutual understanding that we'd both been children trying to navigate adult emotions, that we'd both paid a price for the choices we'd made. She sent me Christmas cards for the rest of her life, and I sent them back. Small gestures, but they meant everything. She died 5 years ago, and I went to her funeral, said goodbye to the girl who'd been my sister, my friend, my stepmother, my teacher in the hardest lessons about forgiveness and grace. The truth is, betrayal is part of love, just like joy and sorrow and loss are parts of love. You can't have one without the others. And sometimes, the very act of being betrayed teaches you something about your own capacity for forgiveness, your own strength, your own ability to survive heartbreak and come out whole on the other side. I'm not telling you this story to make you feel sorry for me, or to judge my father and Susan for the choices they made. I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand that families are complicated, that love is complicated, that sometimes the people who love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. And that's okay. That's human. That's life. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you of your own complicated family, your own difficult choices, your own journey toward forgiveness, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes we all need to be reminded that we're not alone in our struggles, that other people have walked this path before us and survived. And if you've enjoyed hearing from this old grandmother, well, subscribe to this channel, because I've got plenty more stories to tell. After all, when you've lived as long as I have, you collect a lot of stories, and some of them might just help you understand your own life a little better. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And remember, forgiveness isn't about forgetting what happened, it's about choosing to carry love instead of anger. Sometimes, that's the bravest thing you can do. If this story has touched your heart, if it's reminded you of your own complicated family dynamics, please leave a comment below and let me know. Your stories matter too, and sharing them helps all of us feel less alone in our struggles. Don't forget to subscribe for more true stories from this old grandmother's heart. I've got 70 years of stories to tell, and each one taught me something about love, loss, and the complicated beauty of being human. Thank you for listening, and remember, forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing to carry love instead of anger.